The trailer for The Bad Batch Season 3 released back in January, and it hit us with a very special surprise when, at the tail end, none other than Asajj Ventress showed up, sporting a cool yellow lightsaber and this time not bald? Wow! And of course, because I'm a loser incel virgin who hates all things fun, I took issue with this because her being alive at this point in the timeline directly contradicts a canon book that released back in 2015 called Dark Disciple. Serving as a novel version of what was originally planned to be an 8-episode Clone Wars arc, it follows Ventress and Jedi Master Quinlan Vos on a mission to assassinate Count Dooku, which ultimately leads to the pair falling in love and Ventress sacrificing her life to save Quinlan, both from Dooku but more importantly from himself. This novel finished the redemption arc that the Clone Wars set her on, where she went from an evil Sith lackey to someone with love and light in her heart. A lot of people really don't like this book, and frankly, I haven't read it in several years. I really don't remember the finer details as much as I do the broad strokes. The two meet, they fall in love, Ventress joins the light while Vos pulls toward the dark, and she ends up saving him from the edge. It's a nice concept anyway, and I think it's a fine enough send-off for this version of her character. So of course, her appearing in the Bad Batch trailer threatened to undo that narrative closure, on top of already breaking canon. Now, those of you who've been following my channel for some time will most likely have seen, or at least heard about my Dave Filoni video from like 2 years ago, where I criticized him for stomping all over the book continuity with his shows, both with the old EU when he was working on the Clone Wars, and now with his more recent works that don't fit in line with the novels and comic books that have released under Disney. I have no intention of going over all those details again, but there are a few things that are worth saying. A, that video was aged like fine wine, as most people in my comments have been sure to tell me. Since then, there have been several more book contradictions that are directly the result of Dave, or at the very least happened under his supervision. And B, given the fact that all of the Disney continuity is a horrible, jumbled mess that constantly contradicts itself as well as the original films, I've become pretty apathetic to this over the last several years. Don't get me wrong, it's still an issue for all the reasons I outlined way back in that video, but I just don't give a shit anymore. Star Wars could literally release a new show where Kirk and Spock show up and do the Cupid Shuffle in order to resurrect Dumbledore so we can stop Thrawn from killing Hopper from Stranger Things, and I just wouldn't care. It just doesn't matter at this point, you know? All that's to say, when the trailer dropped, my reaction was more just me going, yeah, figures, and then moving on with my life. And I mean, I saw a lot of cope defenses for it on, like, Twitter, you know, just your typical Star Wars fans will defend literally anything as long as it has the Star Wars logo on it type of shit, and it was all very funny, but of course, now that the episode is actually out, we can talk about it. We can discuss which defenses panned out, which ones didn't, and how the actual return of her character was handled. Boy, am I excited. And before any of you try to pull that whole the books don't matter thing, I really don't care what your stance is on that front, because the showrunners themselves have directly stated multiple times that they acknowledge the existence of Dark Disciple. They claim that it would still be canon and that the show would work in tandem with the continuity of that novel. So with that in mind, we're going to be looking at this with the understanding that Dark Disciple is supposedly canon, and if that doesn't work for you, I just don't know what to say, honestly. Like, at this point, it just seems like you're being deliberately obtuse. Also, I should make it clear that old Davey Boy isn't technically the main showrunner for The Bad Batch. He is credited as an executive producer, and of course, he did help create the show, but it's mainly run by a woman named Jennifer Corbett, from what I understand. The only reason I blamed Filoni for contradicting the canon comics in the first episode is because, again, he created the show, and this was the pilot episode, and one that he co-wrote. And similarly, I blame Dave for what's going on now with Ventress, because Corbett and others working on the show said in a StarWars.com article that it was his idea. So yeah, before any of you try to jump down my throat and absolve Dave of any of his wrongdoings, there you go. Now, the first and most obvious defense was that this might have been a flashback or something set during the Clone Wars at some point after season 5 or 6, presumably. I remember thinking that's pretty much the only thing they could have possibly done that would have made this make sense, but now that we have the episode, we can say for a fact that that's not the case. So, alright, what else is there? Well, maybe she faked her death, or she was resurrected or something. I mean, that's pretty much the only other argument I saw anyone making, some variation of that basic idea. Since the episode came out, I've even seen some people arguing that the book itself set up the possibility of her returning, which, again, it had been a while since I'd read it, but that definitely did not sound right to me. I distinctly remember, in fact, that her death scene did describe it as a full-on death, and that she then spent several months being held at the Jedi Temple before Obi-Wan finally took Vos back to Dathomir, where they laid her to rest. Months. And I went back to check. That is what happened. But the book also mentions that her body was put in stasis shortly after she died, and people are kind of clinging to that. Specifically, people are pointing to this passage to support their argument. Slowly, the black water closed over her, accepting her into its embrace. He blinked. Was the water changing color? Tendrils of mist began to rise, green and glowing. Green, like the Dathomiri magics Ventress had spoken of. Green, like the water of life. Some have declared that this scene is describing her being placed into magic Night Sister waters, and then, I guess, just being resurrected by her dead sisters, who can apparently do that. We'll circle back to that in a minute. And I guess the fact that Ventress describes these waters as a place where she was reborn is supposed to also support that theory. But even setting aside the fact that she was obviously referring to a spiritual rebirth, one that we actually see in the Clone Wars as she was being baptized into the sisterhood, even if I were to be really generous and act like you can in any way interpret these lines to mean that still directly contradicts this bottom part here from the same exact page. Kenobi's eyes widened. He heard it too now, the whispers of women's voices. The Force had reclaimed Dathomir's wayward child, and as Voss reached out in it to send the woman he loved a final farewell, he thought he could make out a single word. Sister. Asajj Ventress, at last, had come home. Do you guys know what it means for the Force to reclaim someone? I know I keep using the word cope, but here's the thing. There is absolutely no credible way to look at this page and interpret it any other way than that Ventress is dead and that her spirit has joined with those of her fallen sisters. It is written unambiguously as the final send-off to her character. That is just a fact. If your teacher asked you to do a book report on this and you actually unironically handed in that interpretation of the final page, I would hope you weren't expecting to get into a good college because you're making shit up. You are looking for things that just aren't there, and I'm sorry if that comes across as mean or condescending, but it's the truth. If I'm wrong and there's some other part of the book that actually does hint to Ventress being resurrected that I'm just not remembering, then feel free to enlighten me. I looked on Wikipedia, and apparently it stated that this pool is actually able to resurrect people as long as they've only been dead for a short amount of time, and that's why people are pointing out the fact that she was put in stasis right after she died. So I guess the magic waters would register her as recently dead. I definitely don't remember that being mentioned in Dark Disciple, but apparently that comes from some source book from after the fact. That's definitely not what those waters were ever implied to be in the Clone Wars, and that would be extremely world-breaking, so I hope to God the writers aren't actually planning on making that the official explanation. They don't actually tell us how she's alive. In fact, they pull a J.J. Abrams and tell us that it'll be explained later, but isn't relevant for the sake of this episode.
A good question. For another time.
So, yeah, that might very well be what they go with. Yay. Just for the sake of argument, if we were to humor this and say that is what that scene was setting up and it's gonna be the explanation, then I guess we're just full-on jumping the shark with the fact that the Night Sisters can just resurrect people. Like, not zombies or anything like that, which was already pretty damn absurd. This would be establishing that through Night Sister magic, you can just fully cheat death. You can bathe in the waters of life and come back fully cognitive. Ventress in this episode doesn't really appear any different than she was before. She's still very smart and capable, adept with the Force, and handy with a lightsaber. There are seemingly no drawbacks to her condition. I suppose I appreciate the fact that they're trying to severely limit it, if this indeed only works on people who have been dead for a short time, but that's still just kicking the can down the road. Because if someone can have been dead for months, but they only appear recently dead because they were put in stasis, then all someone who knows about Night Sister magic would have to do when someone they care about dies is put them in stasis, then fly them over to Dathomir and have the Night Sister ghosts work their magic. If you wanted to argue that this only works for Night Sisters, I would ask you where the fuck you're getting that information from. And even if that is the case, no one ever seems to talk about the fact that the Night Sisters are simply practitioners of a type of magic that already exists independently of them, either as an extension of the dark side of the Force or some other energy field entirely. Why are we assuming that only they can wield this magic? If it's possible to use this magic to resurrect people who are recently dead, then anyone with even a modicum of interest in this sort of thing would be able to learn how to do it too, right? Even if the Night Sisters are super gatekeepy about who gets to learn this magic, they're kinda too dead to stop anyone now, aren't they? Wait, hang on! If this type of resurrection works for Night Sisters, then how did they ever even go extinct? Just resurrect them all! Ventress and Talzin survived Grievous's massacre. They could've just dragged the bodies into those waters and waited for however long they needed to. Even if it took a while, they could've eventually had the entire coven back like nothing ever happened. You guys don't seem to be taking full advantage of the things you can do. Unless maybe the Night Sisters welcome and embrace death, but then why did they resurrect Ventress? Alright, I've tangented long enough. That's that interpretation. But I want to just really stress once again that this was narratively intended to be a send-off to her character. Even if you could stretch the lore surrounding this scene to make it mean that she might be able to come back to life, you are lying to yourself if you try to argue that was actually what was being set up here. It's kind of like Palpatine's resurrection in The Rise of Skywalker. You could come up with some lore reason why him returning makes sense in universe, but what the finality of his death in Return of the Jedi achieved narratively was the conclusion of Anakin's arc and the toppling of the tyranny that had a stranglehold on galactic freedom, as well as the destruction of the Sith. His death represented something in the story that is then undone by his resurrection, and the same goes for Ventress. And speaking of that, another explanation I've heard people throw around is that she straight up did pull a Palpatine and transfer her soul into a clone body, which would be really funny considering the entire plot of this show, and this season in particular, is centered around the Empire trying to figure out how to do exactly that. That's what they need Omega for. We're literally seeing that Palpatine is still working on it, with great difficulty despite having all the resources in the galaxy and the expertise of Kaminoan cloners working around the clock. So it'd be really funny if that's just something Ventress already knew all the secrets to, especially since she acts like she doesn't know what the Empire wants Omega for.
And I've never known a clone to be Force sensitive.
Maybe whoever cloned her did so without her knowledge? I don't know. That would open up a huge can of worms, since that would either mean she's not Ventress at all, but just somehow a precisely accurate facsimile who also has the Force and appears to have Ventress's memories, personality traits, combat prowess, etc. Or she is Ventress and she transferred her soul into a new clone body, but somehow doesn't know that she did that, because she seems to genuinely want to help Omega, and if she already successfully pulled off what Palpatine is trying to do, then she should know a lot more than she's letting on. I'm not seriously considering this explanation at any rate, but I figured it was worth addressing. Now, I do feel it's worth saying that I like Ventress. I grew up with both the 2003 and 2008 Clone Wars shows, and she was always one of the more interesting characters to me, especially after she was betrayed by Dooku, and she especially rose in the ranks of my favorite Star Wars characters when I read her stories in the Clone Wars multimedia project. It helps that she wasn't in any way related to the Night Sisters there. I like Asajj Ventress, and I'm definitely not gonna pretend that the idea of her running around during the Imperial era as the morally gray bounty hunter they set her up to be wouldn't have enticed a younger me. I mean, I don't expect the Bad Batch to do anything interesting with her, even if she does show back up, because that show has consistently been where interesting characters and concepts go to die. Nor do I expect anything to ever be done well with her in whatever follows this show, because it's Disney Star Wars, and their batting average hasn't exactly been awe-inspiring. But at least in concept, with competent writers, just like with anything else, I think you could get some really interesting stories out of this now that she's officially alive and well post Revenge of the Sith. I just wish Lucasfilm would stop trying to have their cake and eat it too. Stop acting like the books are totally canon and then contradict them left and right every time a new show comes out. Just make them two separate continuities. At least that would be honest. Anyway, this video was pretty disorganized, but those are my general thoughts on Ventress's return to the forgettable piece of stale bread that is the Bad Batch. Thank you guys for tuning in to hear my inane ramblings, and I will see you when I finally remove my head from my own ass. Thank you, and goodbye.